Okay. Okay, welcome back, everyone. If you're just joining us, I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. This is our lunchtime breakout session, and we're very lucky and very pleased to have our colleagues from the Center for British Art here at Yale University. I'm going to direct this. I'm going to introduce the director of the center, and then she will introduce three of her colleagues who will be presenting to us about new light on the group portrait of Elihu Yale, his family, and an enslaved child, famous painting owned by Yale. It's my pleasure to introduce Courtney J. Martin, who became the new Paul Mellon Director of the Yale Center for British Art in 2019. She did her PhD in art history at Yale about a decade before that. She's an art historian, a curator, and a professor. She began working in New York at the Dia Art Foundation in 2015 and was appointed deputy director and chief curator there in 2017. She's previously taught at both Brown University and the Ford Foundation. So, Courtney, thank you so much for doing this, and over to you to introduce your colleagues. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you very much, David. Nice to see everyone here. I am Courtney J. Martin, the Paul Mellon Director of the Yale Center for British Art. The discussion of the group portrait of Elihu Yale, members of his family, and an enslaved child has framed much of my return to Yale and to New Haven over the last 2 years. I read about its display a few years earlier and have been asked about its presence in the museum in a manner that suggested that an outsized prominence was given to this painting within the collection. As an art historian, the painting held little significance for me, but as a person, I understood that the presence of that child in this painting was not benign. In the wake of George Floyd's murder on May 25th of 2020, the museum came together to discuss the ways in which art resonated with our present. Following that, the Elihu Yale group was formed by YCBA staff to begin the process of fully understanding this painting and its very specific art history. Of the 5 members of the group, 3 will speak today about the project. They are Abigail Lamphier, Senior Curatorial Assistant in the Department of Paintings and Sculpture, Edward Town, Assistant Curator of Paintings and Sculpture and a member of the 18th Century Researchers Group for the Yale and Slavery Project, and David K. Thompson, the Center's Coordinator of Cataloging in the Department of Prints and Drawings. Please join me in welcoming Abigail, David, and Ed.
Thank you, Courtney. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. While you'll be hearing from 3 members of our research team, I want to underscore that we would be nowhere without the hard work and dedication of our YCBA colleagues, Eric James and Lori Missoura. Beyond this team, there are many others who have assisted and guided this research. We're grateful for their advice and expertise. I'd also like to give advance warning that the topic we're discussing and illustrating with slides is potentially distressing, and some of the original records to be shown display outmoded language. Their inclusion is not an endorsement or an uncritical tolerance of the perpetuation of such language. In the summer of 2020, as Courtney just mentioned, with the COVID-19 pandemic in full swing and amid national turmoil in the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, Center's Director Courtney Martin convened a curatorial group consisting of colleagues from various departments across the institution, work collaboratively with the following goal: to re-examine and recontextualize the large group portrait that features the university's early benefactor and namesake, Elihu Yale, and an enslaved child. The mostly web-based project makes known the painting's presence in our collection and attempts to make transparent our relationship to its complex history and difficult associations. The painting was given to the center in 1970 by the 11th Duke of Devonshire in honor of his friendship with Paul Mellon. Its acquisition was championed by the center's first director, Jules Prown, for its likeness of Yale, and Prown's belief that it underlined the ties between England and America. It was the first painting to formally enter the collection, predating the Louis Kahn building built to house the collection by several years. Before it even came to New Haven, there was discussion of pursuing technical analysis to help clear up some unresolved questions. But for one reason or another, this work was never done. We've carried out a renewed study to aid in answering fundamental questions about the painting. Who was depicted? Who made it and why? How did the picture come to Yale? How has it been displayed? And most importantly, how can the center ensure that the picture is contextualized in a manner appropriate to the distressing history it represents? Next slide, please. Our group's first visible act was to remove the historical portrait from the wall so that it could undergo analysis and replace it with this piece by Titus Kaffar titled Enough About You, made in 2016. Kaffar, who received his Yale MFA in 2006, is a New Haven-based American artist who works across media to examine the history of pictorial representation, often reconfiguring historical works of art to reveal unspoken truths and overlooked subjects. Next slide. Kaffar had seen the Elihu Yale group portrait when it was on display in the center's 2014 exhibition, Figures of Empire, Slavery and Portraiture in 18th Century Atlantic Britain. Before 2014, the painting had spent most of its half a century at Yale in basement storage, as it was not put on view publicly, save for a 1981 exhibition on the conversation piece. It also hung in the Berkeley College dining hall for a time. In fact, in last night's keynote conversation, Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and Yale alum, recalled her realization that she had seen the painting during her time at the university, noting that this kind of imagery was woven into the fabric of the campus. It is the movement of this painting and other portraits of Yale that we've traced in 3 timelines in the web story published on the center's website early this spring. Slide, please. Enough About You directly responds to the group portrait by reworking and collapsing its composition and literally reframing the child to shift the viewer's focus. Kaffar's sensitive revision removes the silver collar and shifts the child's gaze outward at the viewer. In his own words, he wanted to find a way to imagine a life for this young man that the historical painting had never made space for in the composition, his desires, dreams, family, thoughts, and hopes. The research project and this intervention in the gallery space became a springboard for the center's 3-part online symposium, The Politics of the Portrait, a series of conversations among artists, collectors, curators, and scholars to consider potential approaches, revisions, and additions to the canon of art history, curating, and art making. Slide, please. The third and final program was a conversation between Titus Kaffar and the art collectors Arthur Lewis and Noen, who had generously loaned Enough About You to the center. Lewis and Noen have built an art collection renowned for its focus on contemporary women artists and artists of color. The talk focused on Kaffar's practice, how Enough About You came to be, and the evolution of his work. Slide, please. Kaffar also discussed his commitment to the next generation of artists and curators and his relationship to the local community. He lives and works in New Haven, remaining committed to the city. In 2015, Kaffar co-founded Next Haven, a nonprofit arts incubator located in the Dixwell neighborhood, which offers fellowships, residencies, and other professional development opportunities to artists, curators, and students in the New Haven community and beyond. Kaffar continues to support and work with his alma mater, but he's also been able to cast a critical eye at the university's history and legacies of slavery. Slide, please. The act of replacing the historical portrait with Kaffar's work felt energizing and important. Unfortunately for us, Enough About You was returned to its owners in late May of this year, as it is committed to be exhibited at LACMA when the Traveling Obama Portraits exhibition opens in Los Angeles next month. For the duration of the summer, the wall was left intentionally blank as a moment to pause and reflect and to listen to our audiences. A text panel explaining the omission invited visitors to share their thoughts through the center's website, a feature that remains active in the hopes that we'll hear from more voices. Slide, please. A new display has just been installed, which for now brings back the historical group portrait in a different context, alongside works that help illustrate what has been learned.
Good afternoon, everyone. What follows is an explanation of the ongoing research into the picture previously titled Elihu Yale, William Cavendish, 2nd Duke of Devonshire, Lord James Cavendish, Mr. Tunstall, and an enslaved child, referred to here, for the sake of brevity, by its accession number, B 1970.1. can't stress enough that this work is ongoing. So if we were going to give the same presentation next week, there would be more to say. I'd also encourage anyone who's able to make the trip to Chapel Street to visit the centre to do so. We are free, open to all on the afternoons of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday each week. While the group of children in the background of this painting are shown joyfully at play, another child in the foreground brings wine to the seated men. To judge from the painting, he is 10 years old, probably about the same age as the boy in the background we just saw, also wearing a grey coat and red stockings. Like many depictions of people of African heritage in British paintings of this period, the boy's identity has largely been ignored. The collar around his neck is of a type seen in at least 50 other paintings made in Britain between 1660 and 1760. Even though the identity of the figures in these paintings are often unknown, for the most part, the portraits depict individual likenesses taken from life, such as these studies by the court painter Godfrey Kneller show. Such paintings provide a stark reminder of Britain's entrenchment in the transatlantic slave trade, which by the beginning of the 19th century had seen over 2.5 million people ensnared from the west coast of Africa and sold into chattel slavery. These depictions also point specifically to the invidious practice in the 17th and 18th centuries of bringing children, mainly boys of under the age of 10 years old, to Britain to serve as domestic servants in the households of the elite. As such, the child depicted in B 1970.1 would have served in the role of a page, that is, a child attendant, as part of the household of one of the 3 seated men, in a similar vein to the young man in this painting. This portrait by a more accomplished artist than B 1970.1, but as I hope you'll notice, of a very similar format. The setting is an imagined neoclassical portico with a landscape of a garden behind, with a fountain and an avenue of trees, almost identical, but by a different artist. Chattel slavery was ostensibly unlawful within Britain's shoreline, but as these portraits show, this didn't stop thousands of Black children and adults from being brought to Britain over the course of the 17th and 18th century, in an ill-defined, but often violently enforced state of what modern writers have characterized as, quote, slavish servitude. Having already suffered separation from family and often multiple episodes of displacement, there was the constant threat of being sold or resold into slavery abroad by kidnappers or those that may claim ownership over them in Britain. Collars made of silver, steel, or brass, of the type seen in B 1970.1, were not used to tether the wearer to other shackles, but were impossible to divest from the body and served to deter self-emancipation. Within the composition of this painting, the child not only works, but performs another role. He moves from a below-stairs space, the buttery or cellar, to a rarefied patriarchal area, to fill the glasses of the 3 seated men with wine. Here, the central figure is the university's namesake and early benefactor, Elihu Yale. Born in New England, Elihu Yale came to Britain as a child. After spending much of his career as president and governor of the East India Company's Fort St. George in Madras, now Chennai, he returned to Britain in 1699, where he remained until his death in 1721. In this last decade of his life, he became a benefactor to the Collegiate School of Connecticut, which, in recognition for his gifts, changed its name to Yale. Although much about this painting is blunt and crude, to the point it becomes difficult to read, it's safe to say that it was made towards the end of Elihu Yale's life. It depicts him approaching old age, wearing a purple coat, white cravat, and a large full-bottomed wig. He rests one hand on the table and in the other holds a long clay pipe loaded with tobacco. The gold ring, set with a large red stone, probably a ruby, points to the source of his immense wealth that he'd accumulated as a private trader in diamonds and other precious stones while in India. Standing behind him is a young man who rests his arm on the back of the chair and uses his middle finger to keep his place in a book. At the table, the seated figure in blue reclines in his chair and looks across the table in the direction of James Lord Cavendish, wearing red, who faces forward and returns the gaze of the viewer. On the table, there are two small cases, one revealing the tobacco inside, either to be smoked in the pipes or snorted as snuff. There's also a tamper to push that tobacco down into the pipes and a candle to light them. The setting for this gathering is a portico of an impossibly large classically inspired, building, looking out onto a landscape with trees and a formal garden. A pond, fountain, and terrace of trees can just be made out in the distance. There, a young man wearing brown plays the violin for 5 children who hold hands with each other and perform a dance. Earlier this year, for the first time in its history, the painting has been subject to a thorough technical study. This has brought to light new information that corrects long-standing assumptions about what the painting depicts, which in turn have implications for the child's biography. And here you're seeing both the Centre's painting on the left and the Yale University Art Gallery's version of the same composition on a far smaller scale and painted on copper at the Yale Centre for British Art's Painting Conservation Studio. Despite the dramatic difference in size, the copper painting, shown on the right here in this very misleading slide, which makes them look as if they're the same scale, it's faithful to the larger work on canvas on the left and uses seemingly identical palette and a very similar system of paint application. I hope that's easy to observe in these slides. Now, the composition of both paintings has long been thought to mark the successful negotiations in 1708 for the marriage of Anne, daughter of Elihu Yale, to Lord James Cavendish, wearing red, who was the younger brother of William, 2nd Duke of Devonshire. Based entirely upon suppositions made by the then owner, this interpretation first appeared in an article published in an antiquarian journal in 1862 about a country house in Derbyshire called Staveley Hall, which was James Lord Cavendish's home with his wife, Anne Yale. Correspondence from this time shows that over the course of the next 50 years, the identity of the 4 white men in the foreground jumped around, as did that of the children in the background, before finally settling on the configuration that we see here. How did this confusion begin, and how did the painting end up in Derbyshire in the first place? I'm going to rush through this quickly. After James Cavendish died in 1571, his family permitted their friend, the Reverend James Gisborne, to live at Staveley, and it was through Gisborne the painting was eventually inherited by somebody called Francis Ernest Gisborne Bagshaw of Ford Hall in Derbyshire. In 1941, alarmed at the thought of, quote, all these old things going to America, Bagshaw decided to sell B1970.1 to his near neighbour, Edward Cavendish, the 10th Duke of Devonshire. What Bagshaw could not have anticipated and surely would have been disappointed to discover was that less than 20 years later, the next Duke of Devonshire gave the painting to his friend Paul Mellon so it could form part of the collection at the Yale Centre for British Art. The major discovery made by members of the Painting Conservation Department at the Yale Centre for British Art and Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage was the identification of the pigment Prussian blue in the painting, which was used in a mixture of indigo for the blue coat of the man in the foreground. Here you're seeing a cross section, so it's like a layer of cake with the dark pigment of the Prussian blue visible. Why is this important? Well, this is important because Prussian blue was not in use in Britain until the latter part of the 17 teens. Its arrival often pinpointed to the visit of the French painter Watteau in 1719, though it could have arrived a year or two earlier. Whatever the case, the discovery of this pigment in the painting makes the date of 1708 impossible and puts into doubt any association with Anne Yale's marriage contract. So what is going on in this painting? We can be confident about the identities of James Cavendish and Elihu Yale because their likenesses match those in other documented paintings. The identities of all the other sitters are less secure. The long-standing identification of the seated man in blue as William Cavendish, the second Duke of Devonshire, hinges entirely upon that 19th century observation of what they thought was a familial resemblance between the man in blue and the man in red. Yet comparison with securely identified portraits of the Duke of Devonshire, like the one on the left, where he wears the Order of the Garter on his chest, do not bear this out. I'm just going to show you another one here. Very interesting. He's holding either a medal or what is possibly a gem, and the box behind it, a special chest to hold the gems that the Cavendish family prized so heavily and would have procured through their kinship with Elihu Yale. So who is this man if he's not the Duke of Devonshire? Based upon comparisons with other portraits, such as this family portrait, interestingly also on copper on a very similar scale to the UAG version on copper, the most likely answer is that he is Dudley North of Glenham Hall, Suffolk, who in 1706 had married Yale's eldest daughter Catherine, seen here in blue. The son of a wealthy merchant, North was educated at Cambridge University and was a member of the House of Commons. Prior to Catherine's death in 1715, they had 3 children, seen in this painting: Dudley, Anne, and Mary. The 2 eldest children seen here. Now, and I'll just put the side by side of another portrait of Dudley North that I'm going to go and talk about in a moment, and hopefully this is compelling. This is a thicker set man. The portrait on the left, a signed and dated work by Godfrey Kneller, which is documented as well through payments. So this would make the 2 men sitting either side of Yale his sons-in-law, or as he would call them, his sons. In turn, the children in the background are almost certainly Yale's grandchildren, Dudley, Anne, and Mary, who we've just been introduced to, and their cousins, William and Elizabeth Cavendish, the children of Anne and James Cavendish. And their life dates, their ages, do jive with a new date of around 1719 for the painting. The survival of Dudley North's personal accounts for this period provide insights into his family during the 17 teens, which are presented here today for the first time. By this point, North's finances and living arrangements were so heavily intertwined with that of his father-in-law Yale, it's difficult to say where one household ended and the other began. Paintings clearly moved between the family. In 1717, Dudley North paid, quote, Yale's man, the sizable sum of 10 shillings 9 pence for delivering a, quote, present of paintings. Frustratingly, this present of paintings isn't described in any detail, so we don't know what it entailed. Plausibly, it could have included B 1970.1, or perhaps more likely, the version on copper. That same year, in December, Yale's servant received a like sum for delivering a present of North's own portrait, quote, with a new frame put on by him, i.e. Yale, along with 2 globes, perhaps not dissimilar to that of those sent to the university. Music was also an important aspect of life at Glenham and the North London home at Queen Square. Dudley North's account enumerate payments for violin strings, copies of Vivaldi's concertos, sonatas, and operas. Payments which conjure up scenes depicted by Marco Ricci for rehearsals of such operas in London in the period. This, one of two paintings of the same subject by Ricci in the collection of the Yale Centre for British Art. On the far right of this painting is a young man in profile, wearing a livery not dissimilar to that of the child in B 1970.1, who looks above the wigs and fans that flap in his face. It seems safe to suggest that the young child in B 1970.1 would have observed similar scenes as he moved between the homes of Dudley North, Yale, and Cavendish during his youth. In the same set of payments, there are payments to the musician, Francis Dorhon, who was paid for a bass violin, writing a concerto, and quite amazingly, 2.5 pounds of snuff, i.e. the tobacco seen on the table. There were books bought about country dancing, lessons for the children at Mrs. Cavalli's Dancing Academy in London, and a series of payments to one Obadiah Shuttleworth. Now, Shuttleworth was a child prodigy who, by the second decade of the 17th century, was famous in London for his abilities as a violinist, organist, and composer. Between 1715 and 1716, he was paid by Dudley North on various occasions for composing his own concertos and copying those of Corelli, making him a plausible candidate for the man on the far right of the painting, who plays the violin for the children as they perform a country dance. The youngest girl, Mary, leading the others hand in hand while holding a hobby horse. I hope you can just make that out in the slide. The chance survival of a letter at Glenham dating to May 1720, written by Elihu Yale to his son-in-law, Dudley North, provides a useful avenue into understanding the immediate context of the family around the time this painting was made. Yale's letter inquires as to the well-being and health of Yale's young granddaughter, Mary, who he called Molly, and we've just seen her, she's the one wearing pink, who's leading the dance. Yale goes on to describe her temperament and how it might change as she grew older. Then follows a discussion of the weather, North's plans for developing his garden at Glenham, and Yale's own resolution to acquire, finally, a country house of his own near London. This, he declared, was to be Latimer's in Buckinghamshire, a house he would lease from his other son-in-law, Cavendish, seen here in red in the painting, in an attempt to resolve financial difficulties with the estate caused by a rogue housekeeper who'd mortgaged the house and run off with the money. Yale thought Latimer's, quote, a good old large house well stocked with ponds and other amenities, which would serve as the future wedding house, i.e. the marital home of his eldest grandson, William Cavendish, not then yet 10 years old. Yale imagined that improvements to this property would make Latimer's, quote, elegantly delightful, and projected an expenditure of £4,000 or £5,000 on making the house able to accommodate North and his 3 children, sums that significantly exceed the gifts he made to the Collegiate School of Connecticut at around the same time. Yale took the opportunity to ask whether North would allow his 2 daughters to come and spend the summer with him, though he anticipated that perhaps only his granddaughter, Mary, would be allowed to come. And if so, he reassured North that the fresh air would do her good. She would be under the watchful eye of Yale himself and his, quote, her plump aunt Ursula, as Yale put it, and they would not risk her health with a trip to London. So with his legacy secure through the marriages his daughters made, it was Yale's hope that life in the countryside would give him more years to enjoy with his grandchildren. It's this combination of familial pride and aspirations for the final years of his life that's writ large in this composition. The questions remain. Who is the young man standing behind him?
Thank you, Ed. In the 19th century, the young man behind Elihu Yale was identified as the lawyer, Mr. Tunstall. This is difficult to reconcile, however, as the age of this sitter can not be much more than 18. There was an attorney named James Tunstall of Richmond, Yorkshire, whose son was a clergyman, but neither father, who was too old, nor son, too young, were the right age in the first decades of the 18th century to be the youth depicted in this painting. Whatever the case, this is not a member of the Tunstall family. What seems more likely is that this young man is David Yale, the son of Elihu Yale's cousin John Yale of New Haven, Connecticut. Slide, please. Even prior to his father's death, David Yale was being groomed to be Elihu Yale's heir. A letter from 1711 from Jeremy Dummer in London to the Reverend James Pierpont of New Haven gave notice that, quote, "Here is Mr. Yale, formerly governor of Fort George in the Indies, who has got a prodigious estate, and now by Mr. Dixwell sends for a relation of his from Connecticut to make him his heir, having no son." A double portrait of Elihu and David Yale, shown here, once at the North family's home of Glenham Hall, Suffolk, but now at Yale University, is probably the painting mentioned in a letter of 1719, which describes it as an intended gift from Yale to the university, but was never sent. Slide, please. A comparison between the David Yales in the double portrait and the young man with a long oval face, full lips, prominent forehead, wide set eyes, and long nose with a pointed tip depicted in B 1970.1 strongly suggests that it is the same young man depicted in these two paintings. A close study of B 1970.1 has revealed that the young man identified here as David Yale was not part of the original composition, but was added during the process of painting. We know this because his face and upper body are painted thickly on top of a layer of green paint laid down to depict the trees in the background. This layer of green paint had been allowed to dry before his figure was added, and we can see little bits of green poking through the cracks. So upon assigning David Yale to the group portrait, it became imperative to understand more about him and the larger Yale family's place in New Haven. Elihu Yale's father, also David Yale, arrives at Quinnipiac Colony in 1648 with his stepfather, Theophilus Eaton, who became the first magistrate and first governor of New Haven Colony, Connecticut. This is a recreation of a map showing the property of original colonists of New Haven in 1641. Here we see the familiar 9-square grid with the center square being the green. This version is turned sideways with north to the right, so we will rotate it to show north at the top. Next slide, please. In the upper right, between Elm and Grove Streets, we see the estates of Governor Theophilus Eaton and his family, including his son Samuel Eaton and stepson David, Elihu Yale's father. Stepson Thomas Yale has property on York Street to the left and was also allotted fields in the Yorkshire quarter across the street. Next slide, please. To add further context, we've superimposed a map showing the New Haven Green and Yale campus on the 1641 map. We see that Thomas Yale's residential property was approximately where Jonathan Edwards College is now. In 1645, David Yale leaves for Boston, where Elihu Yale is born in 1649. Thomas takes over management and sale of his brother's properties. In addition to residential lands in the center of New Haven, Governor Eaton is granted huge tracts in the second division of lands along the west bank of the East or Quinnipiac River, an area then known as Commons or East Farm. Eaton dies in 1658 and his estate is divided among his children and stepchildren, but it is apparent that Thomas manages the larger share of the estate. In 1660, Thomas is also granted additional lands in the third division of New Haven, expanding up north the Quinnipiac River Valley to the northeast village, or what we now know as North Haven in the upper right-hand corner. He and his sons, John, Thomas, and Nathaniel, become among the first colonial settlers in the area. According to the Annals of North Haven, quote, the Yale possessions covered large areas between Cedar Hill and the present southern boundary line between Hamden and North Haven. Documentation also shows John and Nathaniel, his sons, were granted additional lands along the Quinnipiac for capital improvements and roads to and from shipyards along the river. Location records are sparse, and the few that exist describe boundaries using terms like walnut trees, but most documentation place Thomas and his son Nathaniel on the west side of the Quinnipiac, and John moves to the east side of the river near Bogmire Swamp, where bog iron is dug. The Annals of North Haven documents that a northeast section of John Yale's property was taken to provide a road from the bog mines to a wharf on the river. No surviving map shows exactly where this was, and the annals lament that, quote, no trigonometry of the present day can by any means resurrect these old highway lines. What a delight to the historian, could he but unearth in some dark attic crude diagrams even of these old routes of yore. This is the estate that John Yale, Elihu Yale's cousin, who died when his son David Yale was still young, and at the time Elihu Yale sought out young David as an heir. Slide, please. The probate inventory of John Yale's estate of 1712 reveals the family's wealth. It lists not only luxurious household items, but also lists 4 enslaved African Americans valued at £100 or 25 pounds each. And this represents over 10% of the total value of the estate. So we can confirm that at least one sitter in this portrait belonged to a family whose wealth was directly derived from enforced labor and slaveholding. Further research into the New Haven Parish records has helped us possibly identify 2 of these enslaved people. A sparse entry showing that one Mr. Sampson and Betty from the John Yale household were married in February of 1691 or 2. Since this marriage is 20 years prior to John's death, it is not known if Mr. Sampson and Betty are 2 of the 4 people included in the estate record. Without more documentation, we can only speculate whether they were alive upon John's death or whether the 2 additional people could be their children. It seems that David spent most of the 1710s in London and Wales with Elihu Yale. In 1719, he was admitted to the Inner Temple, one of the Inns of Court of London, and later in the same year, aged 18, became a fellow commoner at Pembroke College, Cambridge. A few other details are known about David Yale. Most narratives have him returning to Connecticut after Yale's death and being ordained a deacon at the North Haven Congregational Church in 1718, but it is more likely that the record has confused him with his cousin David, son of Nathaniel Yale, who was 6 years older and companion to the other deacon ordained at the same time, Samuel Ives. David Yale was given an honorary degree of Master of Arts from Yale College in 1724, and he reportedly dies in 1730.
Time is short. We have a hard stop at 20 past, but I'm just going to sum up and speak a tiny bit about the attribution of the painting. Given that Yale's family was split up several counties in the late 17 teens and was rarely, if ever, together, it seems that B1970.1 was an attempt to unite these members of the family together and to illustrate on a grand scale that Yale's legacy was secure, in spite of having no son. Only a decade earlier, an East India Company official, writing from London to Yale's successor as governor at Fort St. George in Chennai, had given a dismal picture of Yale that cast him as a rich, aspirational, and gullible retiree, duped into buying bad art from disreputable painters, and fixated on securing his legacy through his daughter's marriages. This sneering mention in this letter of a Chowdhury refers to the objects Yale had brought back with him from India, textiles and furnishings, and also tapestries made for him in London that drew inspiration from what he'd lived with and seen in India, such as these tapestries, again, now at Yale. After Yale's death, like many objects we've heard about this afternoon, they came to Glenham and then were acquired by Yale University alumni as the contents of Glenham were auctioned in the early 20th century. Of the sales of Yale's own collection in 1721 and 22, so large they were published over the course of several auction catalogues, only a handful of paintings are described in sufficient detail to be identified today. Of the numerous portraits listed, only one lot names a sitter, making it impossible to know whether B1970.1 or the version on copper were in Yale's collection at the time of his death. From what can be gleaned from the auctions, Yale's collecting practice was typical for his day. He followed the taste of many collectors in Britain for highly finished paintings on a small scale, many of which were made by Dutch artists who'd moved to London in the 17th century. Now, one of these painters is John Varels, and we're seeing an example of his signed and dated work here. Now, he's the strongest candidate as the artist of B1970.1 and the version on copper. Born to a family of painters who'd moved to London from the Netherlands during the second half of the 17th century, some of whom were still life painters, John Varels worked both as a portraitist and a dealer of pictures. So he's the type of figure that could have been in Yale's Chowtree in that letter of 1711 we just heard about. Crucially, he also worked on copper, a technique he'd acquired from his father, Harman. And here's an example of his father's work and the engraving derived from it. Varels was certainly known to Yale, who at the time of his death, we know thanks to the survival of the auction catalogues, owned at least 8 paintings that were attributed to the Varelses. John Varels' earliest paintings date from 1697, which suggests he'd been running his father's studio prior to his father's death. By 1715, he had a thriving practice as a portraitist, but is known today mostly for his 4 paintings of what were described then as the, quote, 4 Indian Kings, commissioned by Queen Anne for Kensington Palace and now at the National Archives of Canada, that were instantly popular as mezzotints. And you're seeing the mezzotints from the Centre's collection here today. Stylistically, Varels' signed portraits provide compelling comparisons with the portraits of B1970.1, as I hope this slide illustrates clearly. Now, what does this new information mean for our understanding of the identity and life of the enslaved child? The painting can now be said to fall between somewhere from around 1719, when Prussian blue is definitely on the palettes of British painters in London, and 1721, when Yale died. Given the youthful appearance of the child, who was thought to be 10 years old, he was probably born in around 1710. It's likely he was brought to England at around the age of 5, and presumably therefore had been in the household of one of the seated men for a number of years. A thoroughgoing survey of the parish registers for the area that Yale and his son-in-law, Dudley North, lived in London, they lived in Queen Square, still there, reveals a small but significant black presence in the Bloomsbury area. But unfortunately, none of the individuals that we've found in those parish registers can readily be identified with the child in B1970.1. Looking for further clues within the painting, it's possible the child's proximity to Dudley North is indicative of a tie between them. There was certainly a black presence in the larger household, in the household of North's wider family. From at least 1721, North's cousin, Francis, Baron Guildford, with whom he exchanged paintings, had a servant named Francis Juba, who was described in this parish register of St. Martin in the Fields, Trafalgar Square, London, as black in this record, but was in fact from India. As a child, Juba served as a page and remained a salaried member of the household of this other branch of the North family for close to 2 decades before being apprenticed as a barber and wig maker of London. Juba was buried in his early 70s in a parish near to the country house where he'd worked with the North for many years. Okay. So to make clear, we're not suggesting the child in B1970.1 is Juba. It is possible, though, that his life took a similar path to that of Francis Juba. But it's equally possible that, like many enslaved children and adults in Britain in the 17th and 18th century, he chose to run away. Here, we're looking at one of over 800 advertisements published in British newspapers in the 18th century, seeking the recovery of an enslaved person who is self-emancipated. At present, we still don't know what happened next in the child's life. What can be said is that in around 1719, his likeness was taken by a London-based painter from a dynasty of artists who, on occasion, incorporated figures of African descent into their compositions, but were trained principally in the depictions of white skin tones. Despite the limitations of John Varels' training and ability, his two paintings, one on canvas, one on copper, are currently the only record of the child's existence. And with all this said, the survival of Dudley North's papers for this period, which we're currently going through, albeit via proxy, cover this period and provide a promising avenue for still recovering the identity of the enslaved child. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, my goodness, thank you, Abigail, David, and Ed, for allowing us this intimate look at how you do this extraordinary work, from the forensic to the archival and then to the interpretive stage. Is just, for a non-art historian, is absolutely fascinating. And the fact that you are still searching for the identity of that African boy is remarkable. And it is, it's one of these never give up ideas, isn't it? It's still possible to find him in that community in London where Yale lived. I only have one thing to add. I wish we had time for Q&A, but our current research tells us, and this is all ongoing, but particularly from Tiana Reed, our chief researcher on the 18th century, and we will hear from her this afternoon, that Elihu Yale's contribution to Yale, this founding gift, probably amounted to a grand total in her research, and what we're going with right now, of 1,162 pounds. Now that came from goods, books, artwork, and cash. The original gift of Elihu Yale was in the neighborhood of 1,100 pounds. That may rise, it may fall some, but that's an extraordinary amount of money in the early 18th century. Again, thank you to all of our colleagues at the Center for British Art for this extraordinary look into your work on this painting, the two versions of this painting, and good luck in your continued pursuit. And we urge everybody to go to the Center for British Art and see this exhibition that they have just opened on this painting and how they are interpreting it. Thank you so much, Courtney, Ed, David, and Abigail, for this wonderful session over lunch. We will return at 1:30 for the start of the next session. So see you all.